I've got a weird relationship with this game. I've thrown it away in a recurring gag in order to get some laughs. But in truth, it's got a fairly decent storyline and a killer soundtrack. It's just a bit ungraceful, as I talked about in an earlier video. Card for that video should be sliding in right now in the top right corner of your screen. In the US, we finally got this game in 2002 with the release of Final Fantasy Origins for PS1. But I found a ton of information and photos about an unreleased NES version of this game that was scrapped at the prototype stage of localization. The idea was to continue with subsequent FF products. Unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, these were never launched, though that doesn't mean there weren't localizations afoot for one or more of them. Ted Woolsey. Woolsey was a translator for many of Square's games in the early and mid-1990s, translating games like Secret of Mana, Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, and Super Mario RPG. Moving past the reviews of his translations, which, in short, ranged from wonderful to abysmal, the quote from earlier suggests that a few different titles were slated for a US release, but were ultimately shelved. Before Woolsey joined Square, translations were done in-house. Hironobu Sakaguchi, the father of the Final Fantasy series, apparently wasn't worried about translating it for other languages until much later on. This is the localized version of Final Fantasy II that we almost got. It is not at all close to completion, it just works. Kaoru Moriyama, translator for Square. Before we dive into the photos of the box art and the game itself, I did want to point out that the game in translation was so close to release, ads were printed about the game mixed in with other titles from the time, giving players a sneak peek of the box art seen here. Note here also that the box art for Final Fantasy Legend 2 was under the same design as the NES Final Fantasy II. I was able to dig up a pre-production drawing of the potential box art for the NES version of Final Fantasy III also, but this could have been the US version of Final Fantasy IV also, considering what happened. More on that in a moment. If it is the NES version of Final Fantasy III, it absolutely falls in line with Ted Woolsey's quote mentioning that a few titles were up for localization, but all were shelved. And eventually this design was scrapped completely because of one small decision. On September 9th, 1991, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System launched nationwide, and with it came earth-shattering changes to the gaming world. Games were faster, had better graphics, and the controller had way more buttons. Innovations were being made left and right, and immediately some legendary games were already available for play, including Final Fantasy IV a couple of months after the Super Nintendo's release. If we look at the design of the Final Fantasy logo, we can see it's way more stylized to appear more regal, something that eventually made its way to Game Boy releases like Final Fantasy Adventure and the Final Fantasy Legend series, specifically Final Fantasy Legend 2 and 3. This design lasted for the next two games in the series, Mystic Quest and 6, until Square made the decision to release its monumental game Final Fantasy VII for the PS1 in 1997. Clearly to capitalize on the release of the Super Nintendo, plans to localize Final Fantasy II were dropped in order to make preparations to release the newest game, Final Fantasy IV, to the US market after finding success with Final Fantasy I the year before. But despite the game being completely shelved, a prototype cartridge did make its round, and many years later it was found. The cutting room floor acquired a ROM of the prototype and made an exhaustive list of all the differences. The link is in the description if you want to see all of them. In the end, there's a part of me that's kind of sad we never got the prototype release of Final Fantasy II, but the other part of me is very happy with the way things ended up happening. I do wonder though if maybe we would have gotten a Super Nintendo version of Final Fantasy V if 2 and 3 were released. But what do you think? Let me know how you feel about the releases that did end up coming out. Do you think that Mystic Quest would have even existed at this point? Since I did mention Final Fantasy IV and its importance on the release of the Super Nintendo, I did want to point out this video where I discuss Final Fantasy IV being the most important game in the entire series.